Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to grant floor privileges to my interns on their shadow days as follows. Vincent Shoeships for June 24th, 2025, and Emma Singleton for July 24th, 2025.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've come to the floor to talk about debt, and more precisely, how the Republican Party has been driving massive increases in debt over the last couple decades, both in two ways. The first way is by particular legislative acts, primarily tax bills that have created enormous debt. And the second is by steadily eroding the framework for budgeting and controlling our difference between our revenues and our expenditures that was created in 1974. If we want to think about the big factors that have been driving up deficits and therefore debt, well, the big factors in recent history, war in Afghanistan, massive. War in Iraq, massive. The Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, the Trump tax cuts of 2017. These were huge factors in vastly reducing revenue, primarily by giving enormous giveaways to the very richest Americans. Well, that's not all the Republican Party's been up to in terms of driving massive increases in deficit and debt. They've also been hard at work destroying the infrastructure that all 100 senators agreed to back in 1974 to get a handle on debt. Well, let's return to the deficits of 1971, 1972, 1973. Those deficits on average were $20 billion. $20 billion compared to $2 trillion now. And yet that $20 billion in deficit, average deficit over those 3 years, was enough to have the members of the Senate and the members of the House say, we have to get this under control. If we don't get this under control, we're going to undermine the ability of our work to provide a good foundation for families to thrive in the future through good, strong programs for housing and health care and education, good, strong programs to create good-paying jobs, good programs for the security of the United States of America. We're going to undermine all of that, the future for the next generation, if we run up these deficits. So they created that 1974 Act. And that 1974 Act had a couple different visions. One was a regular budgeting process. That regular budgeting process was laid out. This is the way that you can, at the front end of each fiscal year, or preparing for each fiscal year, you can lay out a vision for how much you're going to spend and how much revenue you're going to create. And those expenditures will be laid out committee by committee, and then we'll hold people to it, and we can basically do what a family does, have control over our income and our outgo, our revenue and our expenditures, and therefore control over deficits. That was the vision. Now, that bill also created something completely separate from that, and that was called reconciliation. And reconciliation is a special, fast-track, filibuster-free path. For one reason it was created, all 100 senators agreed to reduce the deficit. You can think of Robert Byrd, who was the fiercest defender of the filibuster, that is the 60 votes required to close debate. Yet even he said, yes, I'm fine setting aside that power that gives strength and leverage to the minority for the purpose of reducing the deficit, that one purpose. Well, that was in 1974. Now let's go fast forward to 1996, 22 years later. You have a Republican House and a Republican Senate. It's the back end of the Gingrich Revolution, the election that occurred in 1994 and with people serving from 95 to 97, And there had been several interesting things that happened that year in 1996. And one of them was that Congress said, let's give the president a line item veto so that programs can be struck down by the president of the United States. And the Supreme Court said, not so fast. The Constitution is very clear. It gives the power of the purse to Congress, not to the President of the United States. If you want to give the power to decide what's spent to the President, well, then you have to do a constitutional amendment. Well, that was the end of the line item veto. And then the next thing was turned to, well, let's do a balanced budget amendment. Well, a balanced budget amendment requires 2/3 of each chamber of those duly elected to say yes to the bill, and then it has to be sent out because it's a constitutional amendment to be confirmed by 3/4 of the states. That's a big undertaking. In the Senate, it was 1 vote short of having the 67 votes it needed to be passed. Well, that was a very frustrating situation to be in, 1 vote short. And then the leaders of the House and Senate, the Republican leaders of the House and Senate, said, well, you know, we have this other objective. We want to do a tax bill that will give vast sums of the U.S. Treasury to the very richest Americans, and we know Democrats won't stand for that, so we can't do it the regular order. Let's take that special reconciliation bill, that reconciliation process created in 1974, only for deficit reduction, and let's repurpose it to do deficit increases. But there's a problem there. The whole history was quite clear, and you had 22 years of precedent to back up the plain language. So what's to be done? Well, the leader of the Senate, Robert Dole, brought in a new parliamentarian, Robert Dove, who then created a ruling saying, despite the bill, what it says, and despite the 22 years of precedence, this fast track can be used to do tax breaks and increase deficit. Well, that was a core pillar of the 74 bill, a fast track only for deficit reduction, a filibuster-free path only for deficit reduction. And my Republican colleagues tore it down. Now, they didn't use it immediately because President Clinton, a Democrat, was in the Oval Office. And as it turned out, a deal was worked out on other issues, so they didn't do that tax bill until Bush came in 2001. And then they used that power created in 1996. The reason I'm going through this is to convey that my colleagues who have talked about fiscal responsibility have been misleading America. Because while they talked about fiscal responsibility, in practice, they've been running up massive deficits and debt for the people of this country. Through the war in Afghanistan, through the war in Iraq, through the 2001 tax bill that Bush put forward, through his 2003 tax bill, through the Trump 2017 tax bill, and they've been destroying the discipline for this special reconciliation process that was designed only for deficit reduction. But that nuclear event of 1996, in which black became white and white became black, the total betrayal of those senators who voted, 100 of them, for a special filibuster-free process only for deficit reduction, a total betrayal of them, but 2 things survived. One was that there would be no ability to use reconciliation for deficits creation, increases, outside of the 10-year window. And the third was continuing to use honest numbers. The Joint Committee on Taxation for Revenue, the Congressional Budget Office for expenditures. In fact, CBO was created by that 1974 bill. So nonpartisan entities that would give us honest numbers. So we would quit lying to ourselves every time there was a bill about what it costs. Quit lying to ourselves about what a tax provision change would mean. We'd be honest with ourselves, and it's like a family. A family doing their budget, if they say, well, we're only going to go out to dinner once a month to save money, but the reality is they know that they're going to go out to dinner 10 times a month, they're just deceiving themselves. So they're putting something in their budget that isn't real. So the idea was integrity. Integrity with ourselves, integrity with the American people. But this brings us to this moment, right now, on the reconciliation bill. Because those two pillars of fiscal responsibility that survived the 1996 nuclear action by my Republican colleagues, the two pillars that survived, one, no deficits after 10 years, no increase in deficits after 10 years, and second, using honest numbers, those are under complete assault right now. And it's through something that is called, by my Republican colleagues, a current policy baseline. Well, let me explain what this means. Normally, you have a bill, and there's a provision in the bill, and that provision says, do this. And it goes to the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they say if it's a revenue measure, here's how much money that it will raise, as compared to not having that provision in the bill. Not having that provision in the bill is current law. Putting the provision in the bill is the vision that's being costed out for an honest decision making. So here's a provision, how much will it cost? Here's a change in a program, how much will that cost? That's the normal process, and that's the normal process of integrity in any budgeting process. We're going to make a change in what we're doing. How much will it cost? But along comes the decision by my colleague, who I work with so well on so many things, but on this profoundly disagree with him, the chair of the Budget Committee, and says, let's stop doing that process, where there is a provision in the bill that changes the law, and therefore we will estimate how much it costs. Instead, he says, we will simply pretend that a provision in the bill that ended a tax break, and now the provision continues that tax break, and therefore it costs money as compared to current law, we'll pretend that all along we knew that it would go on forever, and therefore it costs nothing. Well, this is a type of smoke and mirrors that the entire 1974 Act was designed to stop. Let's stop pretending. Let's stop trying to camouflage what things cost when we make decisions, when we pass laws here. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's be honest with the American people. So this strategy, how is this to be accomplished? Well, my colleague, the chair of the Budget Committee, looks to a provision, Section 312 in the law. So let's talk about Section 312. Section 312 is a provision not in Section 313, which is for reconciliation. Section 312 is completely separate, and it has never been used in reconciliation. And it was designed to resolve small technical changes. So let's look at the record of 312. Again, this provision says the chair, actually it says the Budget Committee, not the chair, but the Budget Committee has authority to resolve some technical problems that occur in the process of normal budget bills, not reconciliation, normal budget bills. So here are the times it's been used, this provision from 312. It has always been used in a bipartisan way, always with consultation, support from Democrats and Republicans to resolve a technical issue. For the first time, my colleague, the chair of the Budget Committee, is saying we're going to use it in a partisan fashion, where there's no agreement worked out on how to solve a technical issue. We're going to do something that's pure partisan because we want to hide the cost of this reconciliation bill. A second point is that Section 312 has never been used in a broad fashion. It's always been about a narrow provision, again, not in a reconciliation bill. It's been used routinely to enforce spending allocations by committee. It's been used for the Crime Victims Fund. It's been used for the power marketing administrations. It's been used to prevent double counting of a dairy program. It made some adjustments to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, all these done in a bipartisan way on a very narrow issue. And then there's now, where it is no longer a narrow issue, it's about the entire cost of the bill. 312 has been used to resolve ambiguities. Again, each and every time, resolve ambiguity in a bipartisan way on a narrow issue, except now it's not about resolving ambiguity, it's about lying to the American people about what the bill costs. And has it ever been used in reconciliation before? No, because it's not part of the two sections that control the reconciliation process, 310 and 313. It's not part of that at all. It's never been used in reconciliation. Not once, not ever, because it is not part of the law that guides reconciliation. And finally, I want to emphasize that because it's been about narrow issues, the amount of money involved has been related to those more narrow provisions. Yes, they sound large when they're in the millions. Even once, on the adjustments to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, about $3 billion, $2.8 billion. But now we are talking not about a couple billions, we are talking about more than $36 trillion. Wow. That's something. In every possible way, 312 power, giving the Budget Committee the ability to resolve small technical issues outside of reconciliation, doesn't fit with using it now to create a magical baseline to, well, obfuscate what things cost. Now, the cost of this bill, the provisions in this bill, as compared to not having the provisions in the bill, is a cost of about $3 trillion over 10 years. And I think the most recent estimate, 32 trillion-ish, 37 trillion. And yet, here is and that's over 30 years. Here we have the effort to tell the world that no, don't worry, it's only a couple $100 billion the cost. I was struck this morning by the estimate came from the Joint Committee on Taxation, which laid out that the revenue portion of this bill will now reduce revenue over a 10-year period by over $4 trillion, while my colleagues are telling the world, no, it'll only reduce it by less than $1 trillion. Let's stop that type of destruction of the budgeting process. I mean, it's not just that we are lying to ourselves and to the American people about the cost of this bill. We are also destroying that boundary which said, that survived the 1996, that said there'll be no deficits in any single title in any single year after the budget window, and the budget window is a 10-year period. You know, this morning I read back through Section 313, and right in Section 313, it lays it out again, no deficit creation in any title in any year after the budget window. So I'm coming to the floor to say to my colleagues, do not corrupt the very instruments we created in a bipartisan fashion to control the deficit. Do not use a fake baseline to lie to the American public about the cost of the provisions in this bill. Do not breach the boundary in which you're now going to create deficits beyond a 10-year period. The reason we had that estimate of $37 trillion over 30 years is because now the measures in the bill continue on that create deficits as far as the eye can see, and CBO said we can only estimate it out 30 years. So that's the number. Roughly $3 trillion over 10 years, but $37 trillion over 30 years. And CBO also told us, the Congressional Budget Office, that nonpartisan keeper of integrity in budget discussions, said if our estimate of the interest rate is 1% off, it will cost about another $24 trillion on top of this. So what are we talking about then? We're talking about over $60 trillion over 30 years. How does that compare to what we have now? Well, we are actually in the mid-30s right now in terms of our federal debt. We are now over 100% of debt to GDP. You know, I had thought as I got into this discussion that we were at the 100% mark, and that is that our amount of national debt had reached the amount of our gross domestic product. But when I rechecked it, no, we're over it. We're beyond it. How are we going to be responsible architects of our national journey if we're going to keep pretending that things don't cost in the bills that we pass? If we don't use honest numbers? If we destroy the framework created in '74 that said no deficits after 10 years? That's not the right course. And we will keep raising, we, the Democratic side of the aisle, will keep raising this issue because this bill should never go through this body on false premise, on a fake cost estimate. And why is that so important, reconciliation? Because the budget resolution lays out how much revenue change can be tolerated and how much spending can be done by the various committees. So if you don't have honest numbers, you have a completely phony process. So let's come together and rebuild the bipartisan consensus that we are going to have a stronger framework, a stronger budgeting framework for the national enterprise. As we build up this massive additional part of debt through wars and through tax bills that deliver the national treasury to the richest Americans, as we do that, we are undermining the future of our country. Please, to my Republican colleagues, do not come to this floor and talk about fiscal responsibility. If you can't walk the walk, don't talk the talk. It's that important. It's that important. Well, I'm going to conclude by noting that even without this breaching of the boundaries regarding deficits that run as far as I can see, even without the process of lying to ourselves about what this costs, even without that, this is a terrible bill. This bill is families lose and billionaires win. As simple as that. Cutting nutrition programs, an estimated 4 million children will go hungry. Tax breaks for the richest Americans, tax breaks for billionaires. 16 million people losing health care. Why? To fund tax breaks for billionaires. That's just wrong. There's a better plan. It should be a bipartisan plan where we seek to have families thrive and billionaires pay their fair share. That's a vision we should all be able to get behind. So let's take this terrible bill, this bill that creates debt as far as the eye can see, this bill that creates an estimated $37 trillion in additional debt, or even more than $60 trillion if the interest rate predictions are off by 1% over 30 years. Let's take this bill and let's put a stake through its heart and start over. And instead have that vision of a bill crafted along the lines of families thrive and billionaires pay their fair share. Thank you, Mr. President.